The motion with regard to gender budgeting.
The honourable member for Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to speak to the motion under my name, number 7 on the notice paper. This motion focuses upon the role of and the need for gender-responsive budgeting and a gender budget impact assessment, a public policy tool which I and others here have previously called for and raised on many occasions in this place. However, I think this debate might be the first opportunity provided to this chamber to consider formally such an initiative and its potential contribution to our state. As luck would have it, the parliamentary sitting schedule has provided the opportunity to have this important debate today on the 8th of March, which is in fact International Women's Day. A very appropriate alignment for us to be considering this motion.
I note you're wearing all the colours, the violet, white and green. Give women the vote.
Indeed.
Colours of suffrage.
Indeed, the suffrage colours I'm wearing with pride today. A very appropriate alignment, Mr. President. The 2022 International Women's Day theme here in Australia is #BreakTheBias. This campaign theme is further developed by the International Women's Day organisers as the following, and I'll quote from the website. They entreat us to imagine a gender-equal world, a world free of bias, stereotypes and discrimination, a world that is diverse, equitable and inclusive, a world where difference is valued and celebrated. Together we can forge women's equality. Collectively we can all break the bias. The campaign then asks us to consider taking responsibility every day for breaking the bias in our communities, in our workplaces, our schools, colleges, universities and communities. Mr. President, taking responsibility means taking action. When it comes to breaking the bias in the structures of our governance, it means implementing purposeful, evidence-based, effective initiatives within the mechanics of our policy making and resource allocation. I think we would all agree that in many key aspects of society we've come a long way since the earliest celebration of an International Women's Day, which was in 1911. And certainly since the first time that International Women's Day was celebrated on this particular date by the UN in 1975, the pace of progress has certainly picked up. However, despite this progress, there remain some fundamental aspects where we have simply not come far enough. Not yet. In this regard, and within the context of the motion before us, it's useful to revisit and reconsider the original goals behind the establishment of this International Day. Its inaugural year as a United Nations celebration, 1975, saw a World Conference on Women held in Mexico City, from which evolved the UN Decade of Women and a World Plan of Action agreed to by UN member states. This action plan aimed to eliminate discrimination and promote the status of women globally, and specifically to integrate women into the development process and increase women's involvement in political life. One specific acknowledgement that was the agreement that there needed to be national machinery to advance the equality of women. By the end of that UN Decade for Women, Australia and Canada were recognised as groundbreakers in developing such national machinery. Key to that here in Australia was the pioneering development of gender-responsive budgetary processes in the 1980s. This recognised that any public policy proposals, whether to do with transportation, taxation, education, health services, tariffs or whatever it may be, could not be assumed to be gender neutral. It acknowledged that public policy could be better understood in terms of gender impact through a formalised process of review as part of the policy development process overall. A leading Australian academic, Marion Sawyer, at the 2005 UN expert group meeting on the role of national mechanisms in promoting gender equality and women's empowerment, described it as follows, and I quote, "Previously to the 1975 World Conference on Women, public servants had assumed that policies that would benefit men would also benefit women. a presumption most blatantly displayed in overseas aid policies, where development policies targeted at men notoriously increased the workloads of women who were left behind in the subsistence farming sector. Mr President, that's an example that was provided at that time, and we've seen an internationally celebrated day, a decade focused on women's equality and the elevation of awareness globally of the need to structurally tackle discrimination experienced by women play out. However, despite all of that recognition and action, where do we find ourselves in terms of continuing progress? Moving forward or losing ground? It's broadly recognised globally and nationally here and even locally that women have been disproportionately affected during COVID-19. Many warned over the last 2 years that the pandemic risks seeing social cracks and divisions calcify and become entrenched. We are also hearing similar warnings, I would note, within the context of climate change and its likely equity impacts. Just last year, the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Report for 2021 assessed areas that included economic participation and opportunity, educational attainment, health and political empowerment, and it found in 2021 that the preceding year to that, under the influence of the COVID-19 pandemic, it found that the time it would take to close the gender gap had increased by 36 years. The report found that the previous projection that it would take 99 years to achieve equality had seen then the horizon for that extended out another 36 years, taking it to 135 years hence. Effectively, globally, under COVID-19, in 1 year, we lost a whole generation of equality. Let's just pause to absorb those figures, Mr President. By that estimate, gender parity will not only not be seen in our lifetimes, our children will not see it in their lifetimes, nor perhaps their children in theirs when we look at a horizon of 135 years hence. And that breaks my heart, Mr President. So, despite those goals and aspirations of recent decades, some gender-based inequalities which remain entrenched, stalling our progress and keeping us vulnerable to not just not progressing, but in some cases to going backwards. When it comes to a lack of progress or a vulnerability to losing ground, we have to ask ourselves if it's by design or the result of complacency or continued misplaced assumptions of gender-neutral public policy. And maybe, in fact, it's all three to some extent. So today's International Women's Day theme, Break the Bias, demands that we bear witness to and recommit ourselves to tackling those ongoing challenges that we have before us in a meaningful way. We're prompted to ask ourselves, have we got the best tools in our toolkit, and are we employing world's best practice when we're seeking to meet this challenge? Mr President, there are many ways that the current government and previous governments of this state have sought to make progress in tackling discrimination faced by Tasmanian women and girls through structural reform, through targeted investment and public education. We can point to a very positive history of action and leadership in this space, and I want to acknowledge the work that has been undertaken by previous and this current state government towards levelling the gender playing field in that sense. It must be acknowledged that improvements in equality for Tasmanian girls and women, and also more recently for non-binary identifying members of our community, have not been accidental nor incidental over the years. I acknowledge the work undertaken in the Tasmanian Women's Strategy 2018 to 2021 and reported in its 2019 Progress Report. I also acknowledge the Leadership and Participation for Women Action Plan 2021 to 23, which, amongst other things, seeks to ensure the impacts of COVID pandemic upon Tasmanian women are addressed. Clearly, there have also been gains in women's representation in the private and public sector spaces. This government can, and I'm sure we'll note today too, the good progress that's been made in appointing women to government board positions and encouraging women's leadership. We've in fact seen a great deal of progress in political leadership in this state, including 2 female governors now of our state, a state parliament where female representation sits well in excess of half, 50%. Genuine efforts have been made by all governments over the years, and it does not undermine any of those achievements or ongoing efforts to pause, to reflect and to agree that more can be done, and that there are additional government levers which could be pulled, particularly in terms of ensuring our machinery of governance has gender equity built into its design. Policy development and budgetary processes as the fundamentals of our machinery of governance are a ripe opportunity for more progress. Mr President, some may ask, what would a gender budget impact assessment and statement do? In a nutshell, gender budget impact statement is a formal reporting of a gender-responsive budgeting process. In 2017, the OECD report Gender Budgeting in OECD Countries introduces gender budgeting as, and I quote, "The application of gender mainstreaming in the budgetary process. Given that the budget process is the gateway for resource allocation, as well as a key determinant of the standards and qualities of public policy formulation, it is natural that the budget be considered for its likely impact on gender-responsive public governance. An established definition from the Council of Europe 2009 of gender budgeting refers to a gender-based assessment of budgets incorporating a gender perspective at all levels of the budgetary process and restructuring revenues and expenditures in order to promote gender equality." That was from that OECD report, Gender Budgeting in OECD Countries. This tool and this description recognises that every policy initiative in the budget has a potential to impact men, women and non-binary people differently, even if the policy is intended to be gender neutral. It further recognises that these unintended consequences can mean that a policy may result in inadvertently worsening the gender gaps that government in other ways is striving its best to close. A 2021 report prepared for the Queensland Council of Social Service, QCOS, by Dr Leonora Riss described it as thus, and I'll quote from it. "Gender-responsive budgeting involves analysing all policy measures to identify the ways in which the policy can either advantage or potentially disadvantage different cohorts of the Queensland population on the basis of gender. These gender-based differences arise not necessarily by intent, but because of the different industries, different occupations and different roles in the household, organisations and wider community that men and women tend to take throughout their life path." That's the end of the quote. The QCOS report then goes on to say, "Gender impact analysis involves asking the following questions and arriving at answers that are informed by data, evidence-based insights and objective analysis. Who is likely to benefit most from this policy? Who is most at risk of being disadvantaged by or overlooked by this policy? How do particular cohorts of women stand to benefit from or potentially be disadvantaged by this policy? Ultimately, is this policy contributing towards closing gender gaps?" That's from that QCOS report. And while it applies in the Queensland jurisdiction, we can equally recognise it as applying here. Mr President, adopting gender-responsive budgeting and producing a public annual gender budget impact statement would ensure Tasmania's policymakers and legislators are reliably and factually informed on how proposed budgetary measures will impact all Tasmanians. Such an annual piece of governance infrastructure will also ensure key indicators are developed against which actual progress or regress can be identified and measured consistently. There will be scope to evaluate and identify any potential policy contradictions or risks of perverse policy outcomes. Mr President, let me provide an example that demonstrates such a risk, where we can consider how a gender-responsive approach to policy may have assisted in averting some negative outcomes. I'm sure we would all recall that as part of the initial COVID support initiatives, the federal government allowed people whose finances were adversely impacted by COVID to access up to $10,000 of their superannuation between 20th of April to the 30th of June in 2020, and then a further $10,000 in the second application period from 1st of July to 31st of December 2020. Indisputably, Mr President, many Australians regarded this early access scheme a lifeline during those early stages of the pandemic. However, at the time, concerns were raised by commentators and advocates that the positive and or negative ramifications of this scheme would be inflicted inequitably across the population due to gender. In particular, it was raised that it held the potential risk for further widening the gender gap in retirement incomes in particular. And a recent report by the Grattan Institute entitled Women's Work, the Impact of the COVID Crisis on Australian Women, indicates that although the full impacts of that scheme remain unclear and are yet to be fully assessed, the raised concerns were justified. Specifically, the Grattan Institute report highlights the following. Men had a higher take-up than women across all age cohorts, and men withdrew more from their super in dollar terms than women through the scheme. But women withdrew a higher proportion of their total savings because of their lower starting balances. That was from the Grattan Institute report. We know that currently women generally have lower super balances than men, leading
Resumption of debate on the question concerning gender budgeting.
The honourable member for Nelson.
Goodness. Thank you, Mr President. Picking up where we left off prior to lunch, we were discussing as an example of opportunities for gender analysis of policy, that early access to super scheme that we saw at the beginning in the early stages of COVID and some of the gender-related differences in impact that we saw as a result of that scheme. We were noting the Grattan Institute, which had reported that women had withdrawn higher proportions of their total savings, and we currently know that women generally have lower super balances than men, leading to lower retirement incomes, which the Grattan Institute also warned causes the increased risk, I quote, the increased risk of poverty in retirement for low-income and otherwise vulnerable women, especially single parents and those renting in retirement. There are also more women in poverty and financial stress in retirement than men. Now, it may be that had the Federal Treasury at the time been required to produce a gender impact assessment of proposed fiscal policy, including those emergency provisions such as the early super access scheme, it's possible that different decisions might have been made. Possibly active monitoring mechanisms may have been put in place, as well as additional short, medium or longer term remedial or assistance schemes to mitigate any entrenching or calcification of pre-existing financial gender inequalities. While we do not know what may have eventuated in an alternative scenario where gender impact assessments were undertaken as a routine element of public policy, we do know that despite the short-term benefits, one outcome from this particular policy decision has seen women who took it up use a higher proportion of their retirement savings and leave themselves at higher risk of falling into poverty by the time they reach retirement age. And in fact, Mr President, in another aspect of that same initiative to continue the example with it, which has relevance in terms of the opportunities in a gender impact assessment process for policy, is the intersection that it had with another issue experienced largely by women, and that's family violence. We know from local and national research that there was an escalation of family violence during the COVID-19 pandemic. We know that a common aspect of family violence is financial abuse and control. And at the time that the initiative was rolled out, consumer groups warned of the danger that providing early access to super lump sums would create a new opportunity for financial abuse through perpetrators forcing or coercing partners to make withdrawals and then taking control of that money. And in fact, data released just recently by the Australian Institute of Superannuation Trustees, the AIST, just last month, in fact, has looked at the uptake of that early super access initiative and cross-referenced it with data that we have about the prevalence of financial abuse during COVID-19. Their estimate is that it's likely around 70,000 Australian women may have been coerced or forced into the early withdrawal of their super through that scheme by an abusive partner. Now, a gender impact analysis of that proposed policy at the time it was being formulated would likely have revealed risks such as these and provided the opportunity at that point to respond to and to mitigate and to attempt to minimise those risks as part of the planning. But without a structural approach of a gender analysis built into the process, we continue then to play catch-up. Instead of being forewarned and forearmed, we are left trying to manage and to fix the negative consequences after the damage has been done. A proactive structural approach, Mr President, is sensible, effective policy making. Part 1 of the motion before us lists recent national and subnational examples of gender budget impact statements. As mentioned, Australia was once recognised as a global pioneer, in fact, in developing this sort of tool. Hopefully the re-emergence of the federal budget gender impact statement for last year's 2021-22 budget was not a one-off, but will continue as a pattern. Members may be interested to know that currently the Women's Tasmania website provides information regarding the benefits of gender analysis and gender budget statements. It also discusses and provides details of international models that are in place, including those in place in Canada and the Netherlands, as well as some interstate models, including Queensland and South Australia. It's rather ironic, and it's a distinct shame, in my view, that the state government website cannot yet point us towards our very own Tasmanian gender analysis and responsive budgeting model as best practice, as a best practice example. In fact, on that side, it relies on referring back to the Tasmania Together goals from times past as the main example of the Tasmanian government's commitment to furthering the implementation of gender analysis. The Women's Tasmania website also details the fact that New Zealand cabinet papers follow a template which includes a gender impact statement. In fact, currently, along with a general legislation impact statement, New Zealand's cabinet document template also includes a requirement for a gender impact statement, a human rights assessment and a disability impact statement. Unlike most Australian jurisdictions, our trans-Tasman cousins have a culture of proactively releasing cabinet papers, minutes and decisions. So examples of the template that I'm referring to here are readily available on the New Zealand Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet website. Mr President, let's bookmark for another day a broader discussion of such laudable public transparency and accountability practice from an executive government such as we see in New Zealand, and return now to the matter at hand. A gender impact assessment statement applied to policy proposals brought to the Tasmanian Cabinet for consideration and approval would fit really well alongside the current requirement for an economic impact assessment and would complement an annual state budget gender impact statement. To recap, the role of budget gender impact statements is to interrogate and test any assumptions of gender neutrality in the policy and budget process in a systematic and formal manner, and to report on the findings and recommend any recommendations derived from that examination. Should a proposal proceed despite there being acknowledged gender impacts, the decision to do so will be done knowingly and hopefully with additional safeguards and mitigation measures. It will help render the too often invisible ramifications to be visible for the active consideration of our decision makers. And how can that be anything but a good thing? Crucially, another fundamental goal of gender responsive budgeting is to work towards ensuring consistency and cohesion across economic and social policy. Too often it's realised after the fact, or warnings were deliberately ignored at the time perhaps, that policies may have perverse outcomes on women or girls or others who identify as non-binary genders. So while nothing is a panacea, in a complex, shifting sand environment of public policy, gender-responsive budgeting and gender budget impact statements will at least give pause for decision makers to double-check whether there are serious contradictions between social and economic policies proposed and our aspirations for positive change when it comes particularly to gender equity. Mr President, if we turn to the text of the motion before us, I've attempted to provide in section 1 is a series of succinct summaries of the role and the contribution of gender budget reporting. These statements in section 1A there and 1B speak for themselves really, but are notable for being made not by any perceived usual suspects necessarily, or indeed certainly not by radical activist organisations, but instead by conservative and pragmatic entities. Nobody could call the OECD or the IMF radical or militant feminist activists generally. So this tells us that gender-responsive budgeting is considered a mainstream responsible budgeting process to the degree that this process not only makes human rights sense, it also makes economic sense. In section 2 of the motion, I've detailed a quick factual timeline of key Australian actions at both national and subnational levels. As is outlined, Australia has a track record of utilising this equity tool to some degree and at times. I'm also aware that gender-responsive budgeting and policy impact assessments processes have also been adopted across a range of corporate and NGO organisations, as well as some departmental and local government arenas across the nation. The Queensland Office for Women provides a gender analysis online platform which equips organisations to apply a gender lens to their own activities, which I think is an incredibly useful tool to provide to the community. It's interesting to note the information currently available on the Women's Tasmania website under the heading "Why Use Gender Analysis." The website states this: the use of gender analysis helps planners in being aware of historic and current differences in order to produce more effective gender-inclusive policies and programs for both women and men. As well as pointing to examples nationally and internationally, there's also a page on that site that outlines a stage-by-stage approach for a typical gender-inclusive model. Our state government clearly expresses the value of this kind of structural approach through that website for progressing gender equity. So what we have there, Mr President, is the knowledge and the resources we need to implement this form of national machinery, governance machinery, if you will. While both parts 1 and 2 of the motion present statements and factual matters on the historic record, part 3 of the motion, as members will note, could be described, I guess, as the pointy end. It's the ask. This is the component which provides this chamber with the opportunity to send a specific request to the government to have Tasmania enshrine gender impact statements as an integral component of this state's legislative and budgetary policy framework. Some here may wonder whether the proposed timeframe of including such an impact statement in the 2022-23 state budgets is perhaps too tight. Mr President, I do not believe it to be so, as this proposal and this idea has been raised with government on many previous occasions by me and by others, and indeed appears on the government's own Women's Tasmania website and is pointed to as a best practice process. The Grattan Institute report, which I referenced earlier, explicitly recommends, and I quote, "Governments should make gender analysis part of their budget development processes to reduce the risk of women being overlooked or suffering unforeseen consequences from policy decisions." I wish to stress that in relation to the motion section 3, that this motion specifically articulates an analytical budget gender impact statement, as well as a genuine gender-responsive budgeting process. It may be useful here to reiterate what gender-responsive budgeting is not, for the purposes of clarity. It's not unusual to see governments collate any women-specific initiatives and policies into a women's economic statement, or a budget list of matters relating to women, for example, or just potentially to highlight how a particular budget invests in programs specific to the needs of women or girls. And we need to be quite clear, however, that these sorts of lists or statements or groupings of policy initiatives while laudable and valuable, are not the same as a gender-responsive budgeting process or an analytical gender budget impact statement. That doesn't provide the same outcomes that are being called for with those mechanisms. For example, while welcoming the Queensland Government's 2020-21 Women's Economic Statement as part of that jurisdiction's state budget process, commentators such as QCOS stressed that in itself this was not a gender impact statement, nor an example of gender-responsive budgeting, laudable though it was to include it. This is clarified further for us by the UN, and I quote from them: "Gender-responsive budgeting is not about creating separate budgets for women or solely increasing spending on women's programs. Rather, gender-responsive budgeting seeks to ensure that the collection and allocation of public resources is carried out in ways that are effective and contribute to advancing gender equality and women's empowerment. It should be based on an in-depth analysis that identifies effective interventions for implementing policies and laws that advance women's rights. It provides tools to assess the different needs and contributions of men and women and boys and girls within the existing revenues, expenditures and allocations, and calls for adjusting budget policies to benefit all groups." Personally, I would also add into that men and women, boys and girls, and people of other genders or non-binary genders. It's also important to note, Mr President, that genuine gender-responsive budgeting and budget impact statements must also be an analysis for men and boys, for people of diverse genders. Parental leave for fathers is an example of a belated policy recognition of an inequitable assumption about caregiving. More broadly, gender-responsive budgeting also facilitates breaking down traditional stereotypes and notions such as masculinity in ways that may constrain men and boys and redressing some of that. And in turn, tackling those stereotypes may help address other systemic social problems such as violence against women and girls. Lastly, on this point of what constitutes genuine gender-responsive budgeting, I echo calls by public policy and academic commentators that any attempts to provide only self-congratulatory PR-style party political policy highlights packaged up as a gesture towards budget gender impact statements will just simply not cut the mustard. I think it goes without saying that any such eventuality would not be in good faith and would not honour the sentiment and tenor of this motion and its call to action, and certainly wouldn't meet community expectations. To conclude, Mr President, I once again revisit today's 2022 International Women's Day campaign, which challenges us to take the necessary action, and I quote from the campaign materials: "Whether deliberate or unconscious, bias makes it difficult for women to move ahead. Knowing that bias exists isn't enough. Action is needed to level the playing field." Mr President, the current state government is very open about its intent to be aspirational for our state. I believe that gender budget impact initiatives, as proposed by this motion, is a key tool to delivering on that aspiration in a way that puts gender equality and the advancement of all Tasmanians on an equal footing. I believe this proposal to be consistent with state government objectives in this public policy space, its stated aims and goals on inclusion and equality. To paraphrase QCOS's assessment of Queensland's efforts at ensuring policy gender equity, let me quote this: "There is immense scope for the government to lock in and consolidate the progress it has already made on gender equality initiatives by establishing a formal process of gender-responsive budgeting in its policy making. Taking this step to legislate gender-responsive budgeting and invest in the capacity to undertake this process in subsequent budgets would not only strengthen the government's prospects of achieving its gender equality goals, it would also preserve this current government's legacy." As stated, Mr President, I believe while that was put forward in relation to Queensland, I believe it would also equally apply here in this state to our government and to this state government's legacy. As stated in the government's Tasmanian Women's Strategy 2018 to 2021, a person's gender should not be a barrier to opportunity or participation. Formally committing to implement gender-responsive budgeting and the provision of a formal budget gender impact statement is consistent with the government's commitment as stated in that strategy. And I quote, "to making Tasmania a state where all people have equal opportunities to participate in Tasmania's social, political, economic and cultural life." I also note one of the welcome recommendations made by PESRAC in its final report last year was for the government to adopt the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, as a policy framework moving forward. As members may be aware, SDG number 5 is gender equality. Hence, the recommendations detailed in part 3 of this motion would be both consistent with, as well as a tangible mechanism by which to deliver that particular SDG in accordance with the PESRAC recommendation, which of course, Mr President, we are given to understand the Premier has accepted in full on behalf of his government. Mr President, it would be so very fitting for this chamber on International Women's Day to collectively do our bit to break the bias by taking action that is available to us here and now by voting for this initiative to call for the establishment of equality-focused machinery of governance. Such a vote would, in good faith, encourage further action by the Tasmanian Government to deliver Tasmania's own state-based gender budget impact assessment process and statement. Let's put the building blocks in place to support our aspirations for this state and the people of Tasmania and vote for meaningful action and structural reform. I commend the motion to the House.
Question is that the motion be agreed to. The honourable member for Pembroke.
Thank you.